I did not meet Dracula at the height of his legend. I met him several hours before he ought to have died, which is a much less flattering condition in any species and positively ruinous in a nobleman. He arrived in the Carpathians on a wet black night with half an army looking for him. One lung doing the work of memory rather than respiration, and enough blood on his boots to suggest he had either lost a battle or mistaken diplomacy for a recreational sport. In fairness, with Vlad those categories often overlapped. At the time, I was beneath an old chapel built by men who had made the classic architectural mistake of choosing ominous hilltop, without first asking why the hill had already been ominous for several million years. Humans do this constantly. They find some place where reality has gone slightly soft around the edges, where sound does not behave, where dogs refuse to sit, where priests wait with salt in their mouths and no explanation, and they say to one another, "Yes, this seems an excellent place to build a sanctuary." Then, several generations later, they wonder why the sanctuary has eldritch occupants. I had chosen the chamber below that chapel for a period of retreat, which mortals would insist on calling sleep because they have the spiritual imagination of damp table linen. I was not sleeping, at least not then. I was withdrawing from local dimensional traffic, reducing unnecessary manifestations, and allowing certain undesirable thoughts to settle to the bottom of myself like sediment in a ruined harbor. It was not a social hour. It was certainly not an hour for receiving wounded aristocrats. Then he bled through the door. Vlad did not stumble in dramatically. That would have at least shown theatrical self-respect. He lurched down the stairwell one hand at a time, leaving a long dark smear on the old stones. His armor cracked, his face pale beneath the mud, his mouth set in the stubborn offended line of a man who had not yet decided whether he was dying or merely being inconvenienced by destiny. There are people who look smaller when death is near. Vlad looked more concentrated, as if mortality had boiled him down to the hard little mineral that had always been at the center. He reached the bottom landing and saw me. Now I am aware that mortals often expect these moments to produce screaming, collapse, religious ecstasy, or the kind of gibbering panic that scholars later call incomprehensible awe, because they are too embarrassed to write "the witness wet himself." Vlad did none of that. He stood there swaying, one hand against the wall, and stared at me through a curtain of wet, dark hair with the expression of a man discovering that the enemy camp contains exactly the sort of monster he had privately hoped to negotiate with. He pointed to his fatal wounds and the fountain of blood spilling from him. "You see my condition. Does it amuse you, demon?" I was half submerged in the basin at the center of the chamber, the fluid around me blacker than the absence of light and faintly luminous in those colors that only appear when the mind has already made several regrettable choices. The room itself was older than any prayer ever spoken above it. The columns had not been carved so much as persuaded. Symbols drifted across the walls like thoughts attempting not to become architecture. I regarded him with the stillness of something that has outlived civilizations and has no interest in being dragged into one more provincial blood dispute. That is not how one opens this conversation with beings such as me, I said, feeling my true form fester from the abyss. Your kind has a vulgar habit of calling everything a monster the instant it encounters a will not arranged for human comfort. It is less a classification than an admission of intellectual fatigue. If you intend to die in my chamber, at least die with a more disciplined vocabulary. Then correct me, he said through blood and teeth, with the rigid courtliness of a man too well bred to surrender even while dying. Even half dead, he had the tone of a man for whom insolence was not a mood but a reflex. I disliked him instantly, which I mention only because some historians have tried to romanticize the encounter. There was no immediate recognition of a kindred spirit. There was no grand collision of darknesses. There was rather an ancient eldritch intelligence attempting to spend one evening in peace, and a bleeding Wallachian nobleman behaving as though the underworld were a private audience he had scheduled. Above us, I could hear the dull thunder of hooves, muffled through chapel stone and mountain soil. He heard them too. "If you are not demon," he said carefully, "then you must be one of God's creatures. The sanctuary above is dedicated to Christ. Perhaps you know him or his works." I considered that for a moment. The Nazarene had been a thoughtful traveler, and the memory of those long roads across the east had not entirely faded from my mind. He asked questions most men never dared to ask, and he listened to the answers with an unsettling degree of patience. "I walked with him for a time during his journeys toward India," I said at last. "A curious young man, very earnest about suffering." Vlad went very still. "Do not mistake acquaintance for jurisdiction, however," I continued. "The chapel above you is a respectable effort, but it was built upon a hill that had already been sacred long before your species learned the word." He took a step nearer and nearly fell for his trouble. Only then did I bother to examine the extent of the damage. Sword wound through the side, broken ribs, internal bleeding, exhaustion layered over fury with that peculiar density only rulers and fanatics ever achieve. He had carried himself past the point where lesser men become corpses. It was not admirable. Admirable men die with restraint. It was, however, impressive in the way avalanches are impressive. Destructive, graceless, and impossible to politely ignore. If there remains any mercy in this chamber, extend it to me once, and once only. Let me keep my life. You enter my chamber bleeding on the stone, and carrying half the forest on your boots, and the first words from your mouth are demands. Among your species, I believe this is considered a grave discourtesy. Vlad swallowed and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Our Lord Jesus would have brought the stranger inside and fed him. I tilted my head slightly. "Then ask him. He's upstairs." Stared at me, searching for words that were slowly struggling to come out of his throat. "I am not your priest," I continued, "nor your judge, nor the keeper of whatever covenant you believe governs this valley. If you require the attention of your god, I recommend speaking to him directly. It has always struck me as inefficient that humans insist on asking everyone else first." Silence gathered in the chamber like fog. "But he does not answer," Vlad said at last. "Most entities do not," I replied, stirring the void spawn in the cauldron. A secret essence I gathered from the realm of Vanaheim. It is one of the defining characteristics of entities. "Perhaps," he belabored, "perhaps he is waiting to see what you will do." For the first time since he entered the chamber, I did not answer immediately. Memory has an unfortunate habit of arriving without permission. Entire centuries drift back the way dust moves through a shaft of sunlight, and suddenly one finds oneself standing again on some forgotten road, beneath a sky that belonged to a much younger world. There had been another traveler once, barefoot, dust on the hem of his robe. A man who spoke to strangers as if they were neighbors and to enemies as if they might someday become friends. He had listened longer than most, longer than priests, longer than kings, longer even than the philosophers who believed patience itself was wisdom. He had understood more than any of them. Not everything, of course. No human ever does. But enough to recognize the outline of the larger machinery. "You mistake the nature of the conversation," I said at last. Vlad frowned. "The man of whom you speak did not wait upon my decisions, nor did he seek my counsel in the way you imagine. Then you knew of our Christ." "Yes," I replied, "and he rejected my gospel entirely." The prince stared at me as if the word itself had struck him. Rejected it. Quite deliberately, he told me that the world was not yet ready to hear such things. Vlad's brow furrowed in confusion. "And you accepted that judgment?" "I accepted its accuracy. Few among your species have understood the shape of the larger order, but he came closer than most. It was precisely for that reason that he refused it." I shrugged slightly. "Which for a creature of my scale moved the candles along the wall like reeds in a breeze." He was correct. Vlad's pain was finally returning, and he began asking for small comforts at first that became far more abstract and fantastical as his end drew near. And it was at that point, too, that I really began to feel that old Nazareth energy perching on my shoulder for what I would or wouldn't do. "Then grant me this," he said, "a measure of power, a crumb from the table of whatever dark estate you belong to." I leaned closer to him from the cauldron. "No, make peace with yourself, and meet your God." At that, he laughed once, a short, ugly sound that ended in blood. "Then what use are you?" I could have killed him for that. Many things in the room could have killed him for that, some of them more politely than others. Instead, I watched him continue to stand out of what was now clearly an intimate professional hatred of collapse. Then, perhaps because delirium was loosening old scraps of language in his mind, or perhaps because some ancestral memory of older rites stirred at the edge of his desperation, Vlad straightened as much as his wounds allowed, and said in a voice suddenly formal, "Then I ask not as supplicant nor soldier nor Christian prince. I ask under the law of threshold and roof beam. I have crossed into your hall, bleeding. Name me guest or kill me at your door." That irritated me far more deeply than the previous insolence. "There are laws older than nations, older than churches, older even than the stories men tell to disguise appetite as virtue. Hospitality is one of them. Not human hospitality, which is mostly decorative and collapses under the slightest pressure, but the older law, the law by which entry, recognition, and temporary protection become binding once properly invoked. Most mortals do not know it. Fewer still can speak it. But I know of it, and I, Vlad of Wallachia, use it now and cast it down at your feet." This miserable, blood-slick little tyrant had stumbled onto it by instinct or inheritance, and laid it at my feet like a legal trap. I was silent long enough for him to smile. "I see," he said softly. "So there are rules." "Of course there are rules. Only barbarians imagine power is most pure when it is unrestrained." "You are calling me a barbarian in a subterranean shrine beneath a church while sitting in a basin of what I assume is unlicensed blasphemy." He had been looking at me until his his eyes flickered to something else. They grazed past my shoulder to the pillar behind the basin. Most mortals would have seen nothing there but age, water stain, and shadow. The inscription did not sit upon the stone so much as haunt it, its lines curving in angles the human eye was never meant to follow for long. It was not my deepest name. That would have turned his skull inside out, and spared us both the inconvenience. But it was a name of office, of threshold, of recognized sovereignty, and that was trouble enough. I saw the instant he understood. Not the whole lore, of course. Men like Vlad never understand the whole of a thing, but they understand leverage with a speed that would shame scholars and priests alike. Blood was running down his side, in dark sheets. His boots had left half a body's worth of argument across the stones. His breath had gone ragged, yet all at once his face changed, not with hope, which is for peasants and missionaries, but with calculation. He straightened as much as the wound allowed, and looked at me with the rigid courtliness of a man dressing himself in protocol, because armor had failed him. "Then I shall ask correctly," he stated briskly. A bad feeling moved through the chamber. I said nothing. Silence, on rare occasions, is the only dignified form panic can take. His gaze did not leave mine. "Will you receive me as guest?" Cthulhu. The hush that swept through the room felt complete in its omnipresence, perfectly still. The candles ceased their trembling. The black fluid in the basin tightened around my arms like a thought interrupted. The old symbols along the walls stopped drifting and held their shape with sudden malicious clarity. Even the sound of pursuit from above, hooves, men, steel, seemed to draw back a pace, as though the mountain itself had paused to listen. There are laws older than gods, and one of the more irritating among them is that recognition, once properly spoken at a threshold, binds the hearer as well as the speaker. He had named the host within the host's own chamber. He had invoked guest right under roof and stone, while bleeding at the edge of death. He had done it with just enough precision to make refusal ugly. I stared deeply into his mortal coil. He was swaying where he stood, pale from blood loss. One hand braced against the pillar, but there was nothing weak in his expression now. He had found the hinge in the universe and put his fingers in it. "You insolent little vertebrate." His mouth twitched. "Then I am correct. You are alive enough to be annoying. Do not confuse the two." Above us came the muffled crash of men forcing open the chapel doors. Vlad did not even glance upward. "Will you receive me?" he asked again. "Or shall I die at your threshold with your name on my tongue?" That did it. The basin around me darkened by a degree no mortal instrument could have measured. I rose just enough to let the chamber feel the full inconvenience of my displeasure. "You have no idea," I told him, "how close you stand to being folded into something educational." "Nevertheless," he said, blood at the corner of his mouth, "I remain at your threshold as guest. For one bright instant I considered killing every man above us, collapsing the chapel, sealing the chamber, and pretending none of this had occurred. Unfortunately, law is law, even to Eldritch gods, and there are only so many ways one may remain sovereign while publicly violating guest right in one's own hall." I closed my eyes. When I spoke, the words tasted like old iron. "I receive you as guest until dawn, no longer. You will take only what is required to preserve that right. You will not mistake necessity for favor, survival for kinship, or my restraint for permission. His breath left him in something very close to triumph. That offended me afresh. "Thank you," he said, voice wavering like a candlelight. "Do not," I replied, "make the mistake of thinking gratitude improves things for you. I should have killed him. In retrospect, history would have improved in several areas if I had simply reached across the chamber and folded him into a cautionary stain. But law is law, as I said, and I had been asked correctly beneath a roof not built for men, by a creature on the edge of death whose request had become binding the moment it became intelligible. So I did what any ancient being of refinement and catastrophic future regret would do. I honored the law in the smallest amount permitted by cosmic etiquette. I reached into the air beside the basin and withdrew the contract. You will have sanctuary until the rising of this local sun, I lectured. You will receive only enough of my blood to sustain that right, no more. You will not drink twice. You will not mistake remedy for kinship. You will not attempt worship. You will not turn this into culture. His eyes, dark and exhausted, lifted to mine with unbearable alertness. Your blood, he said like a wounded rat still struggling with the instinct for food. I reached into the basin and drew up one single drop. It hung above my hand, thicker than any mortal fluid, dark as collapsed space, and threaded through with glints that did not belong to light so much as to memory. It was not blood in the mammalian sense. It carried no simple oxygen, no chemistry a physician could flatter himself into charting. It was a binding medium, a liquid archive of authority, lineage, threshold, shape, refusal, and the body's right to continue being itself when reality grew argumentative. In a being like me, it functioned properly. In a being like Vlad, it was a catastrophe with excellent posture. He looked at it the way starving men look at kingdoms. One drop, and if this goes wrong, I want history to note that I was explicit. He sank to one knee, whether from ritual instinct or blood loss I could not say. I let the drop fall onto his tongue. For a moment nothing happened. Then every candle in the chamber bent away from him. His spine arched so violently I heard one of the broken ribs shift. The wound in his side sealed, then reopened, then sealed again as his body struggled to interpret what had just entered it. His pupils swallowed the color from his eyes. His hands clawed at the stone. The symbols on the walls moved toward him and then recoiled, like dogs approaching an unfamiliar fire. Somewhere above us, the horses in the chapel yard began screaming. He did not cry out. That, more than anything, is why I knew he would become a problem. He stayed on one knee, shaking, one hand braced against the floor, breathing as though each breath had to be individually conquered. When at last he looked up, his face had changed only a little, which was worse than if it had changed entirely. The mouth was a fraction too still. The eyes had acquired depth in the wrong direction. He looked like a man whose reflection had begun receiving separate instructions. What, he said carefully, was that? A temporary legal accommodation, a blessing? From an eldritch god, I replied, wryly wondering what the god upstairs thought of my divine authorship on this day. Vlad attempted a smile, but it was aristocratic and bore the weight of an unknowable calculus. There are smiles which express gratitude, relief, triumph, devotion, even madness. This one expressed administration going permanently wrong. I knew in that instant that he had heard none of my prohibitions. He had taken sanctuary for invitation, remedy for inheritance, threshold law for privilege. He was already reorganizing the experience into dynasty, symbolism, appetite, and self-mythology. I had given a dying prince one night's ride to continue, and he had received it as permission to become a genre. Above us, the bells of the chapel began ringing of their own accord again, nervously, as if it were echoing the tales of Cassandra from Greek mythology. Vlad rose, steadier now, and touched his own side where the wound had been. His fingers came away only half bloody. He looked at them with reverence so indecent I almost rescinded the gift on aesthetic grounds alone. You may remain until dawn, I said again. After that, you leave. His gaze stayed on his hand. Above us, the chapel doors finally gave way. The sound carried down through the stone, with the clumsy authority of men who believed violence was the same thing as inevitability. Boots struck the stairwell, steel rasped against wood, and somewhere a voice shouted Vlad's name with the triumphant certainty of a hunter who has already begun composing the story of his victory. Vlad heard it all. His head turned slightly toward the stair, and for a moment he stood very still, testing the strange new strength settling through his limbs. The slow, deliberate beat of blood in his ears that was no longer entirely his own. When he looked back into the dark corridor beyond the chamber, there was something new in his expression. A cool, administrative curiosity of a man discovering that the rules of the evening had changed in his favor. From the side, I perceived a faint but undeniable alteration in the prince's mouth, the upper incisors extending ever so slightly beyond their former measure, giving his smile a sharpness that had not belonged to it before. "It seems," he said quietly, turning toward the dark hall, "that I have guests to receive." Humankind would later attempt to describe the place where Dracula and I had our first encounter as the Scholomance, a charming provincial myth about a mountain school where devils instruct promising students in the finer points of catastrophe. In some versions, I was the devil, and in others, Dracula and I were both disciples. This is flattering in the way that a child's drawing of an eagle is flattering to the concept of flight. I did not see Vlad again for some years, which in my experience is usually how one recognizes a mistake has survived long enough to become hereditary. One can have a disaster in the room, certainly, a rupture, a plague, an emperor, but the truly durable catastrophes are the ones that leave politely, reorganize themselves somewhere else, and return wearing regional influence. By the time I crossed his path again, he was no longer merely a difficult man who had outlived a wound by abusing ancient hospitality law. He had become an institution, which is far worse. Individuals can be killed. Institutions reproduce through architecture. He had taken a fortress in the mountains, though fortress is perhaps too generous a word for a building whose guiding aesthetic principle appeared to be drafty stone verticality and contempt for visitors. The place clung to the cliffside like a bad inheritance. Wolves gathered below it without being commanded, which was the first sign the blood had begun broadcasting in a language other predators could hear. Dogs in nearby villages would not go near the road after dusk. Horses rolled their eyes wide and sweated at empty air. Mirrors in the surrounding valley acquired that thin, unreliable quality of objects receiving contradictory instructions. Most men looked into them and saw themselves. Some looked in and felt, if only for a second, that the reflection had arrived late. Naturally, the locals called this sorcery. Humans do love a vague noun. I came upon the castle just before dawn, more out of irritated curiosity than obligation. The older I become, the more I find that curiosity and exasperation share a hallway. Inside, the place smelled of wet stone, wax, old iron, and the faintly sweet rot that occurs when mortal blood has been introduced to ideas above its education level. Vlad met me in a hall, with cathedral windows blacked over from within. He was dressed, to my immediate annoyance, as though he had been waiting for a painter. His posture had improved. His face had not. The eldritch contamination had settled into him now, not as beauty exactly, but as over-definition. He looked too deliberate around the eyes, too composed around the mouth, like a portrait that had learned to stand up. "Old friend, you have returned," he said as if we were equals. "I came to inspect for any damages. You said I was not invited twice, but for you, Cthulhu, I invite you always. I see your attitude has improved now that you're not dying any longer." Vlad's mouth curved faintly, though his hand remained propped against his temple like a man enduring a lecture he had heard before. "Dying," he said thoughtfully, "is rarely the most interesting thing about a man." His eyes moved downward toward me without lifting his head from his hand. "You ancient beings are so fascinating to me. My immortality could very well never expire, and I would still only know the shallow end of your wisdom. I see now that I was foolish in asking for a measure of your power, and I am so very glad immortality is mine to bear from less." His eyes lowered toward me without lifting his head from his hand. "For what is a man in the end?" he continued thoughtfully. "But a miserable little pile of secrets. Time did not take him all at once. That is the first misunderstanding mortals make about transformation. They imagine a single midnight, a single bite, a single ecstatic corruption in which the old self falls away like a discarded garment, and the new creature rises complete, lacquered in destiny, already furnished with appetite's poise and the necessary contempt for mirrors. But Vlad was not born in a gesture. He accumulated. He thickened into himself over years, then decades, then those strange velvet lengths of night by which certain men are measured more truthfully than by calendars. My blood did not so much replace his mortality as interrupt it with exquisite rudeness. It lengthened his life, yes, but only under conditions so narrow and exacting that any lesser mind would have called them punishment. He could move only in darkness. He could gather power only under the indulgent cover of evening. Daylight did not kill him in some clean, heroic burst of theology. It simply reminded his body that what sustained him had never been meant as a permanent arrangement. And so he adapted, because adaptation is the one virtue men of conquest possess in abundance, even when all finer virtues have rotted out of them. He learned to think in knights the way kings think in provinces. He began to understand that immortality, such as it was, would not be handed to him as one receives a crown, with witnesses and music and immediate legitimacy. It would have to be built from repetition, from concealment, from habits so patient they began to resemble liturgy. He learned which roads belonged to merchants and which to mourners, which monasteries kept records worth stealing, which physicians were vain enough to be bought, which noble houses hid disgrace behind curtains thick enough to become useful. He fed, yes, because the blood required continuity, required replenishment, required the warm and vulgar solution of lesser blood to keep its older permissions active in mortal flesh. But feeding alone does not found a dynasty. Predation by itself is merely appetite. Vlad, to my endless fascination, understood that appetite without administration is peasant work. So he began gathering to himself not merely victims, but dependents, conspirators, widows, physicians, discarded second sons, frightened scribes, excommunicated clerics, village girls who had buried too many brothers, soldiers who had outlived too many lords, and those spectral little opportunists history always breeds in the corners of failing empires. He learned from each blunder with an elegance I had not expected. A village drained too quickly became suspicious. A region terrorized without artistry became unusable. A servant ruled by fear alone eventually fled, prayed, or poisoned the wine. Then one must cultivate loyalty with greater sophistication. One must become necessary. One must improve the roads, reduce banditry, keep grain stores guarded, punish rapists, end disputes swiftly, frighten tax collectors into moderation, and make the peasantry whisper not merely that their lord is terrible, but that under his terrible hand, things nonetheless function. There is no public relations strategy in Europe older or more durable than being monstrous with results. This was the true innovation, and I watched it with the sort of interest one reserves for biological heresy that begins, against all reason, to display civic competence. He discovered that if one wished to survive in the imagination of mankind, one could not remain a mere nocturnal accident skulking from crypt to crypt with blood on one's cuffs and grandeur in one's head. One had to become legible, marketable, in the broad and miserable human sense. The villages beneath his mountains grew safer at night than neighboring lands under Christian princes. Wolves kept to the forests, as if some darker lord had already taxed the territory. Trade routes stabilized, certain crops improved. Midwives who served his households found themselves suspiciously well protected. Corrupt magistrates vanished. Children were warned not merely that the Count would drink them, but that he would know if they lied. The distinction mattered. Fear alone breeds revolt. Fear braided with efficiency breeds myth. And of course he bit them. He bit them out of hunger, out of experiment, out of loneliness, out of vanity, out of that old aristocratic desire to see oneself echoed in finer and finer vessels. Some died of it, because my blood in its thinnest derivative remained an insult to ordinary anatomy. Some lived badly, and from that bad living a people began to emerge. Not a race, not yet, nor even a court in the formal sense, but a night-bound fraternity of revisions, all of them carrying some warped inheritance of that first contractual era beneath the chapel. They could not cross thresholds unbidden because their founder had survived by invitation. They recoiled from day because the blood still remembered that it had been licensed only until dawn. They drank because stolen longevity is expensive, because the body requires a medium through which to argue with death, because all grand curses eventually reduce themselves to maintenance. Yet among them, one also found discipline, etiquette, hierarchy, and that strange grave courtesy predators sometimes develop when they realize civilization is easier to harvest than chaos. Years became decades, and decades became the soft black corridors through which legend walks, dressed as memory. Vlad grew more precise, not less. Age refined him. Failure refined him. He learned to let superstition work on his behalf, to let peasants exaggerate where accuracy would only diminish the product. He allowed churches to name him devil when it improved his borders. He allowed frightened noble families to imagine him decadent when in truth he was, in administrative matters, almost offensively practical. The old mistake of my blood had given him longevity. Yes, but he did the more astonishing thing himself. He gave that longevity style, and after style, continuity, and after continuity, a social function. He built not simply a lair, but a system. Men sent tribute to him and called it prudence. Women whispered of his court with dread and envy in equal measure. Scholars condemned him in daylight and took notes at dusk. I had expected corruption. What interested me was curation. I had expected a wound in history. What he made was an institution with excellent cheekbones. And as I watched the knights accumulate around him, as I saw how carefully he selected what to preserve and what to consume, how he turned appetite into governance and isolation into mystique, I began to understand that vampirism, in his hands, had ceased to be merely a grotesque side effect of eldritch contamination. It had become a way for humanity to confess what it truly admired. Not goodness, never goodness, order, beauty, permanence, protection purchased at an indecent price. They feared him, certainly, but fear is only the first language of reverence. In time they came to him for justice, for patronage, for secrecy, for punishment, for miracles, for the removal of inconvenient husbands, and for the restoration of roads no bishop had managed to keep from collapsing in 20 years. In that sense, he improved society, if one is willing to use the phrase with the proper nausea. He made the world more habitable by teaching it to live beneath a predator who understood branding, etiquette, and grain storage. That more than the blood, more than the fangs, more even than the strange hereditary tyranny of the night, is why he endured. Men do not remember monsters merely because they kill. They remember the ones who organize. I approached him in the hearth of his castle one night. "Do you miss the daylight?" I asked him at last, glancing toward the shuttered windows, where the morning pressed faintly at the edges like a creditor too polite to break the door. For the first time since I had entered, Vlad's composure altered in a way that interested me. It was not fear exactly. Men like him do not fear cleanly. It was the tighter expression of a creature discovering that power has clauses. I don't even recognize my own kind anymore. What use would I be if I stepped out into the light? The gift had been meant to preserve him until dawn, not beyond it. The blood had entered him with a term attached, a local star clause, a temporary exemption from death that was never supposed to become permanent. His body, naturally unwilling to surrender its theft, responded in the most human way possible, and converted a technical limitation into a family curse. Sunlight did not destroy them because it was holy, or pure, or morally superior. It destroyed them because the blood had been licensed for one night, and their tissues had spent generations committing document fraud against the morning. You have roused a great interest in me, I admitted, which I have never done to another mortal before or since. He glanced back over his shoulder. That is quite a compliment, old friend, and I shall be careful not to call you a demon this time. Do not cheapen the moment, I said with crumbs of kindness, an unfamiliar layer of emotion I had not used in a while against the millions of years of isolation my kind endures. That pleased him more than he wished to show, perhaps. He had already begun arranging himself as though the room were a portrait, and history had been asked to wait outside until he found his light. Your kind always survive badly, I went on. You have taken one drop given under compulsion of law and turned it into appetite ceremony and a list of highly inconvenient side effects. By all reasonable standards, you ought to have died of it. And I am confounded as to why I simply don't take back what I loaned. Perhaps because you are cosmically bored and your projects still give you interest, he said. Regardless, I remain. Yes, I chuckled. Like mold in a monastery. He smiled at that. Good. He should smile. Fear would make him smaller than the part, although I suspected it was genuine. These days, he was an incredibly important figure in the human and vampire world, and mild disrespect, even in the form of humor, had consequences. I moved closer, not threateningly, just enough to remind the chamber which of us had been here first. Tell me something. What do you imagine comes of this? He did not pretend modesty. That, too, was refreshing. A lineage, he announced, gazing into the fire like it spoke ancient things to him. A house, a nobility of night, something enduring. Enduring, I repeated. That dreary mortal word for refusing to go away. His eyes sharpened. Call it what you like. If your blood has chosen not to kill me, then perhaps it has better taste than you do. That earned him a laugh, which annoyed me at once. That was when the wager suggested itself as classification with entertainment attached. I had no wish to own him. Ownership is for insecure gods and men with property law. But I did wish to see whether this mongrel thing forming in him could become more than a provincial scandal with fangs. Very well, I concluded, after running scenarios in my mind. Let us be precise. You think this condition of yours is the beginning of a legacy. I think it is a grotesque but interesting accident with excellent cheekbones. So we shall make a wager. Now he turned fully. The wound had not made him humble. It had only made him more concentrated. What are the terms? If within a century you turn this contamination into something the world cannot ignore, something coherent enough to breed something meaningful, and folklore on its own merits, then I will concede you are not merely a dying prince who drank above his station. And if I fail, then you will have been what most founders are, a vivid mistake. And perhaps if I am not having a good day, recover what is mine. He considered that for half a breath, then gave a small nod. And what do I win for surviving up until now? I looked at him, at the black courtliness of him, at the hunger already learning posture inside his face, and found the answer arriving with irritating ease. Perhaps a fitting name. He reclined in his seat. I already possess one. You possess several. Mortals are forever trailing titles behind them like broken bells. I mean a true name for the thing you are becoming. That interested him. And what, he asked, do you call it now? Dracula. He heard in it not a chain, but a shape. At last he said, "That sounds like either a curse or a dynasty." "With you," I replied, "I am prepared to leave room for both." Dracula said nothing for a moment. He stood in that black-red stillness of his, one hand resting on the carved back of a chair, as though the room itself had been arranged to flatter his silhouette. Then he answered with more honesty than I had yet heard from him. "I will make it survive then." He said it without bravado, which is how I knew he meant it. This wounded prince turned nocturnal technicality. This elegant little legal disaster wearing a man's face, and understood at last what had taken shape beneath my hand. I had not saved a mortal. I had given history a negotiator with fangs. "See that you do," I told him. Then I left him to the dark, to the shutters, to the wolves gathering below his walls, and to the long labor of teaching mankind that it will forgive almost any monstrosity provided the roads remain safe and the tax collectors vanish on schedule. In the years that followed, they would call him Count, Devil, Tyrant, Lord, Butcher, Miracle, Disease, Prince of the Night, and half a dozen other provincial little nouns by which frightened civilizations flatter themselves into thinking they have understood a thing. But I had named him correctly first, Dracula. And because the universe is vulgar, theatrical, and deeply committed to letting one bad decision breed descendants, the name survived.